In our AS level, we had learned about solvency ratio. The first solvency ratio was our current ratio, right?
Yeah.
What is the formula for current ratio?
As current assets divided by current liabilities.
And what is the formula for quick ratio, liquid test
Current
ratio?
asset current asset minus inventory divided by current liabilities.
Okay, fine. So now we are going to talk about our A level solvency ratio. And our A level solvency ratios are 4. Okay. So we learn it as GWIN. Okay.
Hmm.
First is the gearing ratio. Then is the working capital cycle ratio, interest coverage ratio, and net working assets to revenue ratio.
Yeah.
Okay. What are the new solvency ratios that we're going to learn in our A
Gearing
level?
gearing ratio, interest cover, working capital
No, G
cycle.
win. G win. G
Oh, GV.
win.
Okay.
Okay. So
Okay.
first is,
First is gearing ratio.
second,
Second is working capital cycle.
third,
Interest cover,
fourth is
net working assets to revenue.
net working assets to revenue ratio. So first we'll talk about the gearing ratio. What is a gearing ratio? Do you know?
A gearing ratio is how much of the capital is borrowed.
How much capital is borrowed? When you
Yeah.
compare it with what?
When you compare it with your total capital.
So when you compare it with your total capital, you know that in your total capital, what is the percentage of your borrowed capital? Are you
Yeah.
with me?
Yeah.
So in the gearing ratio, the formula for gearing ratio is your total debt
Yeah.
over the total capital employed. When I'm
Yeah.
talking about total capital employed, it is what?
Total capital employed. It is the total capital
Total capital employed is total capital
that is borrowed and that is owned.
owned funds plus borrowed funds. So
Yeah.
in this owned funds plus borrowed funds, what is the proportion of your borrowed funds?
Hmm.
That tells you your gearing ratio.
Yeah.
Okay. So it is total debt over
Yeah.
total
Total
capital
capital
employed.
employed.
When I'm talking about total debt, every debt carries a fixed percentage of interest.
Yeah.
Okay. So the total debt is also called the fixed cost capital.
Hmm.
So the formula could be total debt over capital employed,
Yeah.
or it could be your fixed cost capital over your capital employed,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be your borrowed funds over total capital
Total capital
employed.
employed. Okay.
Okay. So the formula for gearing ratio is, can
Total
you
debt
please,
divided by total capital employed. Fixed cost capital divided by total capital employed, or borrowed funds divided by total capital employed.
what does your gearing ratio show you?
Gearing ratio shows us how much capital is borrowed and owned.
Okay. So in your total capital employed, what is your borrowed capital and what is your owned capital? Okay.
Yeah.
What do you mean by a highly geared company?
Highly geared means that the company has more borrowed funds than owned. So this comes with
That
high risk.
so there is high risk. So
Yeah.
the proportion of fixed cost capital is
Mm-hmm.
little more. Okay.
Mm.
In the total capital.
Yeah.
Your total capital has a greater chunk of your borrowed funds and
Yeah.
very small money is your own money.
Mm.
So if I say that my company is highly geared, what
Mm-hmm.
does it mean? It means that the loans are more, the
Loans
interest is more.
yeah, yeah.
If I say that my company is low geared, what
Means
does it mean?
owned funds are more and borrowed funds are less. And it's a low risk business.
Low risk, but there is no obligation to pay a lot of interest and
Yeah.
dividend can be paid out of profit.
Yeah.
So how will you decide whether a company is high geared or low geared?
it's more than 50, it is highly. If it's less than 50, it is low. If it's exactly 50, it will be neutral.
Okay. So the first solvency ratio was gearing ratio,
Gearing.
right?
Yeah.
Second was,
Second was working capital
can
cycle.
you give me the formula for working capital cycle ratio in days?
Inventory turnover plus trade receivable turnover minus trade payable turnover divided by.
Oh,
Uh,
no, nothing.
okay, okay.
No divide. You get the answer in days.
Yeah,
The
sure.
next, the
Is
next ratio
interest coverage ratio.
interest coverage ratio. Can you tell me what does interest coverage ratio tell you?
It shows how many times we can pay the interest.
Profit can cover interest how many times?
Yeah.
What does the interest coverage ratio tell you?
How many times the profit can cover interest.
Interest. So what is the formula for the interest coverage ratio?
Profits from operation divided by interest payable.
And you get your answer in.
We get answers in times.
What is the meaning of interest coverage ratio?
How many times profits can pay interest?
How many times your profits can pay your
Pay
interest? Which, what would be better? Larger the better.
better.
So
Yeah.
if you have a larger interest coverage ratio,
Yeah.
that means
It's better.
profits, that
Can
means
cover
profit,
more interest.
yeah, profits will be able to pay interest higher number of times.
Yeah.
It will give safety to your lenders
Yeah.
that even if the profit falls in the future, the interest will be able to pay.
Mm-hmm.
It will also give safety to your ordinary shareholders that even after paying interest, there will be money that will be left in the business for the payment of dividend.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you give me solvency ratios? What are the solvency ratios that we learned up till now?
GWIP. Given,
G.
given.
What is G?
Gearing ratio.
Formula.
Gearing ratio is fixed total fixed costs.
Fixed cost capital.
Yeah, total fixed cost capital divided by total capital employed.
Total capital employed. What is better?
Low risk.
Higher or lower?
Low.
How do you know whether it is a highly geared or a low?
Highly geared is more than 50%, lower is less than 50%, and neutral is exactly 50%.
Then what is the second one?
Second one is working capital cycle.
Formula.
Formula is assets, working is inventory turnover plus trade receivables turnover minus trade payables turnover.
Answer is in.
Answer is in D's.
What is better, positive or negative?
Negative.
Negative is better. Next
Yeah.
ratio.
Next ratio is interest coverage ratio.
What is the formula?
Profit from operations divided by interest payable. It shows how many times process profits will be able to cover interest.
Okay. What is better?
Higher.
Higher the better. Now N. N will be net
None.
working assets.
Yeah.
Net working assets
Yeah.
to the revenue ratio.
Mm.
What is N?
Net working assets to revenue.
Can you give me how do you calculate net working assets?
Mm. Inventories plus receivables minus trade
Net
payables
working assets, you will calculate inventory
plus
plus
trade
trade
receivables minus trade
minus the
payables.
trade payables. What does this ratio tell us?
It tells us, mm,
How efficiently
yeah,
you are using your net working assets
mm,
to generate sales.
mm,
Okay, net working assets to
mm,
revenue ratio. What
yeah.
does this tell us?
How efficiently you're using your networking assets to generate sales.
Again, net working assets to revenue ratio. What does it tell us?
How efficiently the networking assets are used to generate sales.
What is the formula for this?
Formula for this is networking assets divided by revenue into 100.
How do you get the net working assets?
Networking assets equals inventories plus trade receivables minus trade payables.
Is a big net working assets ratio better or a smaller net working assets to revenue?
It's lower.
Why lower? If you have a
Because it shows
lower
that
percentage,
lower assets are being used to generate more revenue.
yeah, so if you have a low percentage of net working assets, it will tell you that you are using a low percentage of your net working assets.
Yeah,
Lower percentage, that means you're using a low percentage of your net working assets to
yeah,
generate what?
revenue.
To generate higher amount of revenue. Okay, it also means that if you have a lower net working assets,
Mm-hmm.
that means you do not have too much money tied up in inventory, you do
Mm-hmm.
not have too much money tied up in the trade receivables.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a lower net working asset, it means you do not have a lot of money tied up in the inventory and the trade receivables. So
Yeah.
this is all with your G win. What is your G win?
Gearing ratio, working capital cycle, interest coverage, and net working assets to revenue.
Net working assets. Working capital cycle, what is better?
Uh, Lower.
Negative. Net working assets to revenue, what is better?
Lower.
Lower. What do you mean by a lower percentage of net working assets?
Lower net working assets are used to generate more amount of sales.
Interest coverage ratio, what is better?
More,
More. Gearing ratio, what is better?
less.
Gearing ratio, less is better. If less gearing ratio is there, means what?
If there is less gearing ratio, that means that it's a low risk business.
If you have a less gearing ratio, it means it has a lower risk business. Now
Hmm.
you have this sum of Daffodils and Tulip Limited. Okay, you are asked to calculate the net working assets to revenue, the interest coverage ratio, and the gearing ratio for these company.
Yeah,
And you also have to comment on it.
yeah.
First to calculate.